welcome to a fireside reading of Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. Chapter 17. That Friday made the last of our fine days for a month. In the evening the weather broke. The wind shifted from south to northeast and brought rain first and then sleet and snow. On the morrow, one could hardly imagine that there had been 3 weeks of summer. The primroses and crocuses were hidden under wintry drifts. The larks were silent, the young leaves of the early trees smitten and blackened. And dreary and chill and dismal that morrow did creep over. My master kept his room. I took possession of the lonely parlour, converting it into a nursery, and there I was, sitting with the moaning doll of a child laid on my knee, rocking it to and fro, and watching, meanwhile, the still driving flakes build up the uncurtained window, when the door opened and some person entered out of breath and laughing. My anger was greater than my astonishment for a minute. I supposed it one of the maids, and I cried, "Have done! How dare you show your giddiness here? What would Mr. Linton say if he heard you?"
"Excuse me," answered a familiar voice, "but I know Edgar is in bed and I cannot stop myself."
With that, the speaker came forward to the fire, panting and holding her hand to her side.
"I have run the whole way from Wuthering Heights," she continued after a pause, "except where I've flown. I couldn't count the number of falls I've had. Oh, I'm aching all over. Don't be alarmed. There shall be an explanation as soon as I can give it, only just have the goodness to step out and order the carriage to take me on to Gimmerton and tell a servant to seek up a few clothes in my wardrobe."
The intruder was Mrs. Heathcliff. She certainly seemed in no laughing predicament. Her hair streamed on her shoulders, dripping with snow and water. She was dressed in the girlish dress she commonly wore, befitting her age more than her position, a low frock with short sleeves and nothing on either head or neck. The frock was of light silk and clung to her with wet, and her feet were protected merely by thin slippers. Add to this a deep cut under one ear, which only the cold prevented from bleeding profusely, a white face, scratched and bruised, and a frame hardly able to support itself through fatigue, and you may fancy my first fright was not much allayed when I had had leisure to examine her. "My dear young lady," I exclaimed, "I'll stir nowhere and hear nothing till you have removed every article of your clothes and put on dry things, and certainly you shall not go to Gimmerton tonight, so it is needless to order the carriage."
"Certainly I shall," she said, "walking or riding. Yet I've no objection to dress myself decently. And see how it flows down my neck now. The fire does make it smart."
She insisted on my fulfilling her directions before she would let me touch her, and not till after the coachman had been instructed to get ready and a maid set to pack up some necessary attire did I obtain her consent for binding the wound and helping to change her garments.
"Now, Ellen,"
she said when my task was finished and she was seated in an easy chair on the hearth with a cup of tea before her,
"you sit down opposite me and put poor Catherine's baby away. I don't like to see it. You mustn't think I care little for Catherine because I behaved so foolishly on entering. I've cried too, bitterly. Yes, more than anyone else has reason to cry. We parted unreconciled, you remember, and I shan't forgive myself. But for all that, I was not going to sympathize with him, the brute beast. Oh, give me the poker. This is the last thing of his I have about me."
She slipped the gold ring from her third finger and threw it on the floor.
"I'll smash it,"
she continued, striking it with childish spite.
"And then I'll burn it.
and she took it and dropped the misused article among the coals.
There! He shall buy another if he gets me back again. He'd be capable of coming to seek me to tease Edgar. I dare not stay lest that notion should possess his wicked head. And besides, Edgar has not been kind, has he? And I won't come suing for his assistance, nor will I bring him into more trouble. Necessity compelled me to seek shelter here, though if I had not learned he was out of the way, I'd have halted at the kitchen, washed my face, warmed myself, got you to bring what I wanted, and departed again to anywhere out of the reach of my accursed, of that incarnate goblin. Oh, he was in such a fury. If he had caught me... It's a pity Earnshaw is not his match in strength. I wouldn't have run till I'd seen him all but demolished, had Hindley been able to do it.
Well, don't talk so fast, miss, I interrupted. You'll disorder the handkerchief I've tied around your face and make the cut bleed again. Drink your tea and take breath and give over laughing. Laughter is sadly out of place under this roof, and in your condition.
An undeniable truth, she replied. Listen to that child. It maintains a constant wail. Send it out of my hearing for an hour. I shan't stay any longer.
I rang the bell and committed it to a servant's care, and then I inquired what had urged her to escape from Wuthering Heights in such an unlikely plight, and where she meant to go as she refused remaining with us.
I ought, and I wished to remain, answered she, to cheer Edgar and take care of the baby for 2 things, and because the Grange is my right home. But I tell you, he wouldn't let me. Do you think he could bear to see me grow fat and merry, could bear to think that we were tranquil and not resolve on poisoning our comfort? Now I have the satisfaction of being sure that he detests me, to the point of its annoying him seriously to have me within earshot or eyesight. I notice when I enter his presence, the muscles of his countenance are involuntarily distorted into an expression of hatred, partly arising from his knowledge of the good cause I have to feel that sentiment for him, and partly from an original aversion. It is strong enough to make me feel pretty certain that he would not chase me over England, supposing I contrived a clear escape, and therefore I must get quite away. I've recovered from my first desire to be killed by him. I'd rather he'd kill himself. He has extinguished my love effectually, and so I'm at my ease. I cannot recollect yet how I loved him, and can dimly imagine that I could still be loving him if... No. Even if he had doted on me, the devilish nature would have revealed its existence somehow. Catherine had an awfully perverted taste to esteem him so clearly, knowing him so well. Monster! Would that he could be blotted out of creation and out of my memory.
Hush, hush. He's a human being, I said. Be more charitable. There are worse men than he is yet.
He's not a human being, she retorted, and he has no claim on my charity. I gave him my heart, and he took and pinched it to death and flung it back at me. People feel with their hearts, Ellen, and since he has destroyed mine, I have no power to feel for him, and I would not, though he groaned from this to his dying day and wept tears of blood for Catherine. No, indeed I wouldn't.
And here Isabella began to cry, but immediately dashing the water from her lashes, she recommenced.
You asked me what has driven me to flight at last. I was compelled to attempt it because I'd succeeded in rousing his rage a pitch above his malignity. Pulling out the nerves with red-hot pincers requires more coolness than knocking on the head. He was worked up to forget the fiendish prudence he boasted of and proceeded to murderous violence. I experienced pleasure in being able to exasperate him. The sense of pleasure woke my instinct of self-preservation. So I fairly broke free. And if ever I come into his hands again, he is welcome to a signal revenge. Yesterday, you know, Mr. Earnshaw should have been at the funeral. He kept himself sober for the purpose. Tolerably sober, not going to bed mad at 6 o'clock and getting up drunk at 12. Consequently, he rose in suicidal low spirits, as fit for the church as for a dance, and instead he sat down by the fire and swallowed gin or brandy by tumblerfuls. Heathcliff, I shudder to name him, has been a stranger in the house from last Sunday till today. Whether the angels have fed him or his kin beneath, I cannot tell. But he has not eaten a meal with us for nearly a week. He has just come down at dawn and gone upstairs to his chamber, locking himself in, as if anybody dreamt of coveting his company. There he has continued, praying like a Methodist, only the deity he implored is senseless dust and ashes. And God, when addressed, was curiously confounded with his own black father. After concluding these pious orisons, and they lasted generally till he grew hoarse and his voice was strangled in his throat, he would be off again, always straight down to the Grange. I wonder Edgar did not send for a constable and give him into custody. For me, he grieved. As I was about Catherine, it was impossible to avoid regarding this season of deliverance from degrading oppression as a holiday. I recovered spirits sufficient to bear Joseph's eternal lectures without weeping, and to move up and down the house less with the foot of a frightened thief than formerly. You wouldn't think that I should cry at anything Joseph could say, but he and Hareton are detestable companions. I'd rather sit with Hindley and hear his awful talk than with little master and his staunch supporter, that odious old man. When Heathcliff is in, I'm often obliged to seek the kitchen and their society, or starve among the damp, uninhabited chambers. When he is not, as was the case this week, I establish a table and chair at one corner of the house fire, and never mind how Mr. Earnshaw may occupy himself. And he does not interfere with my arrangements. He is quieter now than he used to be, if no one provokes him, more sullen and depressed and less furious. Joseph affirms he's sure he's an altered man, that the Lord has touched his heart and he is saved as by fire. I'm puzzled to detect signs of the favourable change, but it is not my business. Yester evening, I sat in my nook reading some old books till late towards 12. It seemed so dismal to go upstairs with the wild snow blowing outside and my thoughts continually reverting to the kirkyard and the new-made grave. I dared hardly lift my eyes from the page before me. That melancholy scene so instantly usurped its place. Hindley sat opposite, his head leant on his hand, perhaps meditating on the same subject. He had ceased drinking at a point below irrationality, and had neither stirred nor spoken during 2 or 3 hours. There was no sound through the house but the moaning wind which shook the windows every now and then, the faint crackling of the coals, and the click of my snuffers as I removed at intervals the long wick of the candle. Hareton and Joseph were probably fast asleep in bed. It was very, very sad, and while I read I sighed, for it seemed as if all joy had vanished from the world, never to be restored. The doleful silence was broken at length by the sound of the kitchen latch. Heathcliff had returned from his watch earlier than usual, owing, I suppose, to the sudden storm. That entrance was fastened, and we heard him coming round to get in by the other. I rose with an irrepressible expression of what I felt on my lips, which induced my companion, who had been staring towards the door, to turn and look at me. "I'll keep him out 5 minutes," he exclaimed. "You won't object?" "No. You may keep him out the whole night for me," I answered. "Do. put the key in the lock, and draw the bolts." Earnshaw accomplished this ere his guest reached the front. He then came and brought his chair to the other side of my table, leaning over it and searching in my eyes for a sympathy with the burning hate that gleamed from his. As he both looked and felt like an assassin, he couldn't exactly find that, but he discovered enough to encourage him to speak.
"You and I," he said, "have each a great debt to settle with the man out yonder. If we were neither of us cowards, we might combine to discharge it. Are you as soft as your brother? Are you willing to endure to the last and not once attempt a repayment?"
"I'm weary of enduring now," I replied, "and I'd be glad of a retaliation that wouldn't recoil on myself. But treachery and violence are spears pointed at both ends. They wound those who resort to them worse than their enemies."
"Treachery and violence are a just return for treachery and violence," cried Hindley. "Mrs. Heathcliff, I'll ask you to do nothing but sit still and be dumb. Tell me now, can you? I'm sure you would have as much pleasure as I in witnessing the conclusion of the fiend's existence. He'll be your death unless you overreach him, and he'll be my ruin. Damn the hellish villain. He knocks at the door as if he were master here already. Promise to hold your tongue, and before that clock strikes, it wants 3 minutes of 1, you're a free woman."
He took the implements which I described to you in my letter from his breast, and would have turned down the candle. I snatched it away, however, and seized his arm. "I'll not hold my tongue," I said. "You mustn't touch him. Let the door remain shut and be quiet."
"No, I've formed my resolution, and by God, I'll execute it," cried the desperate being. "I'll do you a kindness in spite of yourself, and Hareton justice, and you needn't trouble your head to screen me. Catherine is gone. Nobody alive would regret me or be ashamed, though I cut my throat this minute, and it's time to make an end."
I might as well have struggled with a bear or reasoned with a lunatic. The only resource left me was to run to a lattice and warn his intended victim of the fate which awaited him. "You'd better seek shelter somewhere else tonight," I exclaimed in rather a triumphant tone. "Mr. Earnshaw has a mind to shoot you if you persist in endeavouring to enter."
"You'd better open the door,
he answered, addressing me by some elegant term that I don't care to repeat. "I shall not meddle in the matter," I retorted again. "Come in and get shot if you please. I've done my duty." With that I shut the window and returned to my place by the fire, having too small a stock of hypocrisy at my command to pretend any anxiety for the danger that menaced him. Earnshaw swore passionately at me, affirming that I loved the villain yet, and calling me all sorts of names for the base spirits I evinced. And I, in my secret heart, and conscience never reproached me, thought what a blessing it would be for him should Heathcliff put him out of misery, and what a blessing for me should he send Heathcliff to his right abode. As I sat nursing these reflections, the casement behind me was banged on to the floor by a blow from the latter individual, and his black countenance looked blightingly through. The stanchions stood too close to suffer his shoulder to follow, and I smiled, exulting in my fancied security. His hair and clothes were whitened with snow, and his sharp cannibal teeth, revealed by cold and wrath, gleamed through the dark.
"Isabella, let me in, or I'll make you repent,"
he gurned, as Joseph calls it. "I cannot commit murder," I replied. "Mr. Hindley stands sentinel with a knife and loaded pistol.
"Let me in by the kitchen door," he said.
"Hindley will be there before me," I answered, "and that's a poor love of yours that cannot bear a shower of snow. We were left at peace in our beds as long as the summer moon shone, but the moment a blast of winter returns, you must run for shelter. Heathcliff, if I were you, I'd go stretch myself over her grave and die like a faithful dog. The world is surely not worth living in now, is it? You had distinctly impressed on me the idea that Catherine was the whole joy of your life. I can't imagine how you think of surviving her loss."
"He's there, is he?" exclaimed my companion, rushing to the gap. "If I can get my arm out, I can hit him."
"I'm afraid, Ellen, you'll set me down as really wicked, but you don't know all, so don't judge. I wouldn't have aided or abetted an attempt on even his life for anything. Wish that he were dead I must, and therefore I was fearfully disappointed and unnerved by terror for the consequences of my taunting speech, when he flung himself on Earnshaw's weapon and wrenched it from his grasp. The charge exploded, and the knife, in springing back, closed into its owner's wrist. Heathcliff pulled it away by main force, slitting up the flesh as it passed on, and thrust it dripping into his pocket. He then took a stone, struck down the division between the two windows, and sprang in. His adversary had fallen senseless with excessive pain and the flow of blood that gushed from an artery or a large vein. The ruffian kicked and trampled on him and dashed his head repeatedly against the flags, holding me with one hand meantime to prevent me summoning Joseph. He exerted preternatural self-denial in abstaining from finishing him completely, but getting out of breath, he finally desisted and dragged the apparently inanimate body onto the settle. There he tore off the sleeve of Earnshaw's coat and bound up the wound with brutal roughness, spitting and cursing during the operation as energetically as he had kicked before. Being at liberty, I lost no time in seeking the old servant, who, having gathered by degrees the purport of my hasty tale, hurried below, gasping as he descended the steps two at once.
"What is there to do now? What is there to do now?" "There's this to do," thundered Heathcliff, "that your master's mad, and should he last another month, I'll have him in an asylum. And how the devil did you come to fasten me out, you toothless hound? Don't stand muttering and mumbling there. Come, I'm not going to nurse him. Wash that stuff away, and mind the sparks of your candle. It is more than half brandy." "And so you've been murdering on him," exclaimed Joseph, lifting his hands and eyes in horror. "If ever I see a sight like this, may the Lord—" Heathcliff gave him a push onto his knees in the middle of the blood and flung a towel at him. But instead of proceeding to dry it up, he joined his hands and began a prayer which excited my laughter from its odd phraseology. I was in the condition of mind to be shocked at nothing. In fact, I was as reckless as some malefactors show themselves at the foot of the gallows. "Oh, I forgot you," said the tyrant. "You shall do that. Down with you. And you conspire with him against me, do you, viper? There, that is work fit for you."
He shook me till my teeth rattled and pitched me beside Joseph, who steadily concluded his supplications, and then rose, vowing he would set off to the Grange directly. Mr. Linton was a magistrate, and though he had 50 wives dead, he should inquire into this. He was so obstinate in his resolution that Heathcliff deemed it expedient to compel from my lips a recapitulation of what had taken place, standing over me, heaving with malevolence as I reluctantly delivered the account in answer to his questions. It required a great deal of labor to satisfy the old man that Heathcliff was not the aggressor, especially with my hardly wrung replies. However, Mr. Earnshaw soon convinced him that he was still alive.
Joseph hastened to administer a dose of spirits, and by their succour his master presently regained motion and consciousness. Heathcliff, aware that his opponent was ignorant of the treatment received while insensible, called him deliriously intoxicated, and said he should not notice his atrocious conduct further, but advised him to get to bed. To my joy he left us, after giving this judicious counsel, and Hindley stretched himself on the hearthstone. I departed to my own room, marvelling that I had escaped so easily. That's the end of the first part of this chapter. We're going to continue with this chapter tomorrow, chapter 17. So until I see you, please be very well. Good night.